feature a suggestion, that would be lovely as well. And please like and subscribe so that I can continue to provide all of these fascinating books with you. So on to today's book. This is the third installment of this book called Explorers. Botanical Notebook. With text by Florence Thenard and photographs by Yannick Fourie. Let's take a look inside. We've covered most of the very beginning, so if you would like to see these parts, check out our first and second video on this. And today we've covered, I think we're going to start with Pierre Bellon, page 40. Here we are. The Orient, lilies, lilacs, and fortresses. Pierre Bellon, naturalist and spy. Pierre is over here. He has a beard. He has a cap on his head, a little bit of a brim. Pierre Bellon was born near Le Mans in 1517 and grew up in Brittany. Already fascinated with flora, birds, and fish, he was a gardener, an apprentice apothecary, and then a student of botany in Germany. Thanks to René du Bellay, Bishop of Le Mans and brother of a renowned poet, Bellon traveled through Europe, studied medicine, and then became apothecary to the Bishop of Tournon. A fervent Catholic, he wielded a vicious pen against the reformists and appeared to be devoted to the crown, serving Francois I, Henri II, and Charles IX successively. After 3 years in the Orient, Bellon wrote a noted history of his travels and several works on botany and zoology. A controversial, self-taught figure, Bellon was mysteriously assassinated in the Bois de Boulogne in 1564. His travels started in Paris, to Venice, Dubrovnik, to Constantinople, to Konya, Aleppo, Damascus, Jerusalem, Mount Sinai, and up to Cairo, sailing back across to Constantinople. Officially, Pierre Bellon went to the Orient to observe the plants described by Theophrastus in their natural habitats. He traveled as the botanist in their ambassadorial mission sent to the Suleiman the Magnificent by Francois I, who was seeking desperately to ally himself with the Turks against Charles V. The political situation was extremely confused in those years. Alliances were ephemeral, Christianity was torn apart by the Reformation, and the Turks occupied the Hungarian plains. Thus, the French delegation led by the Baron d'Aramon left Venice in secrecy in February 1547. When they arrived in Croatia, Bellon left the expedition to wander around the Greek islands and Crete for several months, barely escaping pirates and Turks. I guess he was on his own odyssey, huh? Quote, who never kill the men they capture, but sell them instead. He crossed the Dardanelles, always taking copious notes on plants, animals, and ruins, and also on well-guarded Turkish forts that, quote, were equipped with good artillery. At Constantinople, Bellon was the first to describe tulips, calling them Turkish lilies. He took an interest in the market stalls, discovering one seed that made people sleep and another that made them happy. He was enchanted with the lilacs and sent cuttings to France in the diplomatic pouch. He traveled all over Macedonia, then returned to Constantinople to meet the new ambassador, Baron de Fumel, who had been appointed by the new King Henry II. Together they left for Egypt, reaching Alexandria and going up the Nile to Cairo. Bellon described garden irrigation, the doom palms with their forked trunks, sycamores with their exquisite foliage, black myrtle that likes to live beside the sea, cassia trees and sycamore figs and balm, that, quote, famous, precious, and rare plant. The ambassador and the botanist crossed the desert to reach Mount Sinai, walking at night to avoid the, quote, violent heat. Bellon made many more observations and drawings of giraffes, chameleons, crocodiles, black ibis, Alexandrian mustard, and Levantine acacia. On the way to Syria, they visited Palestine and the Holy Land, crossed Lebanon, and climbed Mount Taurus. There, Bellon left his traveling companions and spent the winter in Anatolia, a region unfamiliar to Europeans. Was he doing military reconnaissance on Suleiman's territory, or was it a simple naturalist expedition? If he was a spy, he was never exposed as one. His botanical legacy, however, is still present in the gardens of France. Lilac, plane tree, Judas tree or redbud, cedar, holm oak, olive trees, and oleander. We have a quote here by Pierre Bellon. It was already very late when we found a stream running toward Aleppo. Having passed the stream, we left the soft earth behind and entered a stony land of mountains and rocks. We began to see trees bearing olives, pears, plums, and almonds. Mummies. Visiting the Pyramid of Giza, Pierre Bellon was fascinated with the way bodies were preserved in Egypt. He learned that mumia did not mean the embalmed body, but the chemical known to the Greeks as bifalls, or bitumen, which made conservation possible. Magnets. Sailing to Egypt, Bellon was thrilled to discover lodestone, once called Hercules stone, which enabled a person to set out in a small ship in all kinds of wind and weather and cross the sea. The botanical specimen we have over here is Platanus orientalis. This specimen of plane tree was collected in Italy on the eastern shore of the Adriatic in 1869. This species was introduced into Europe by Pierre Bellon and hybridized with the western plane tree to produce the common plane tree. So we have a description card written out here in French. We have a branch of the plane tree here. The 1, 2, 3, spiky. 4. 5 leaves on it, and also contains some seed pods from the tree as well. In search of rare plants, Tredescant the Elder in Russia and Algeria. Here we have Tredescant, his cloak, a very long beard, some hair around the edges, cap, looking rather elderly. John Tredescant the Elder was born in eastern England around 1570. His talents as a gardener led to his employment by Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, and a minister to Elizabeth I. Later he worked for the Duke of Buckingham, whom he accompanied on a failed expedition to relieve La Rochelle in 1628. During his long career as a plant hunter, Tredescant also gathered natural curiosities and displayed them in his London house, called the Ark, establishing the first museum open to the public. His son, John Tredescant the Younger, was also a gardener and collected plants on his 3 voyages to Virginia. Voyage goes from Formentera to London to Archangel. Nearing the age of 50, John Tredescant the Elder had a solid reputation as a gardener to England's aristocracy, and was also a tireless traveler and an experienced merchant. For a decade he searched the nurseries of France and Holland, looking for original and rare plants for his employer, the Earl of Salisbury. Tredescant designed and improved the Earl's gardens, constantly buying new varieties of tulips, narcissus, lilies, iris, roses, anemones, asters, buttercups, cherry trees, pear trees, apple trees, quince trees, and hawthorn. When a British embassy was sent to the Tsar of Russia, he took this opportunity to broaden his botanical horizons. The long journey went around Scandinavia to reach Archangельsk. Tredescant made few observations of the voyage in his journal, except for noting the ambassador's constant seasickness and the thick fog near the Arctic Circle. Arriving in the delta of the Dvina in August, Tredescant wanted to be taken from island to island to see what was growing on them. He discovered an unknown rose, which he named Rosa moscovita, and at the time revealed that he had no sense of smell. Although his nose was not good, he truly had a green thumb. Despite the cold and the lack of fresh water, he returned to England with beautiful carnations, white hellebore, and mercury in addition to his rose. He had barely returned when he set off again in 1620 on an expedition to crush the Barbary pirates of the Mediterranean. For many years, Algerian corsairs had been harassing British shipping, taking crews as slaves and capturing the cargo. The expedition was a military fiasco, but that mattered little to Tredescant, who went ashore in 2 botanist paradises, Malaga and Formentera. He may also have gone ashore in Algeria because he described, quote, the fields of Barbary covered with gladioli. The gardener brought back from these sunny lands roots of starry clover, sarsaparilla, terebinth, white and pink rock roses, fine wild pomegranate with double flowers, all wrapped in damp moss. In 1624, Tradescant rose in stature once more, becoming the right-hand man of the Duke of Buckingham, the very wealthy favorite of James I. His highest honor came in 1630, when he was appointed head gardener to Charles I. His later travels were limited to escorting the Queen Consort, Henrietta Maria of France, known as the Rose and Lily Queen, for the alliance of the Tudor and French crowns. This is a watercolor of fruit and additional fauna from the Tradescant's Orchard 1620. So we have what looks to be maybe a peach tree with its fruits and leaves, greens and oranges, and then we have a snail who's snacking on one of the fruits on the ground. We have a cricket or a grasshopper. And up here we have, it's either a butterfly or a moth. Here's a quote from John. I also saw shrubs of all sorts, the wild roses, single in a great abundance, spread over 4 or 5 acres. They look a great deal like our cinnamon rose. Those who have the sense of smelling say they be marvelous sweet. The Cabinet of Curiosities. Whether it took up a single cabinet or several rooms, a curiosity cabinet was intended to sum up the world and penetrate the secrets of nature. In the 16th century, such cabinets contained a multitude of rare specimens of animal, vegetable, mineral, or manufactured items. The emphasis was on the fantastic, abnormal, and bizarre. Tradescant's Ark held not only exotic plants, but also 2 whale ribs, a stuffed chameleon, and a stuffed pelican, a number of petrified objects, a banana, a monkey's head, shells, a mermaid's hand, precious metals, a fragment of the true cross, and a hatband made of snake bones. Well, that was definitely a cabinet of curiosities, wasn't it? The botanical specimen we have is the Punica granatum. These pomegranate specimens were harvested in Peru between 1831 and 1832. So we have several of these, one small stick, and then some larger branch pieces with their leaves attached. And then a flower here. I guess there are flowers at the top. Serving the first multinational spice company, George Rumphius, soldier and botanist in the Moluccas. George Eberhard Rumpf, known as Rumphius, was born and raised in Germany, where he received an excellent education and also learned Dutch from his mother. In 1646, at the age of 19, he went to fight in Brazil, a territory in dispute between the Dutch and Portuguese. But his ship was captured and Rumphius had to spend several years in Portugal. In 1649, he returned to Germany to assist in his father's business, and eventually joined the Dutch East India Company. Sent to the Moluccas in 1654, he began as an officer and became a merchant, also exploring the local flora and fauna. Although experienced many tragedies, he continued his study of nature until he died in 1702. This one is of a rather angry-looking, he looks like a Puritan. This black coat and white collar and his white wig or hair might be powdered. But he has, looks like, botanical things in front of him on his desk. And some type of storage behind him as well. And here we have him starting in Amsterdam, sailing all the way around Africa to Java and then Amboyne. I assume that's in the Molucca Islands. A new form of capitalist business was born in Amsterdam in 1602. The corporation, known to the English-speaking world as the Dutch East India Company, the United East India Company, set out on the route to the Indies to wrest the flourishing spice trade from the Portuguese. Financed by its shareholders and given a royal charter to operate as it pleased, the VOC soon had a substantial fleet of ships that could both trade and fight. It owned a network of private fortified ports reaching all the way to Japan. This first company to operate worldwide opened a branch in Java and gained the upper hand over commerce between Europe and Asia, especially in the trade between Ceylon, India, China, Japan, and Indonesia. The VOC bought and sold millions of florins worth of pepper, silk, pearls, cotton, and sandalwood, among other commodities. It created a monopoly on trade with the Japanese market and another on the finest spices such as nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon. When George Rumphius, a ship's officer, landed in the Moluccas in 1654, his primary goal was to ensure the VOC's control over cloves. The company had limited the cultivation of this spice to the island of Ambon by removing the plant from all the other islands in the archipelago. Rumphius was fascinated by the flora and fauna and quickly became a trader for the VOC. His goal was to find remedies for the tropical diseases that struck colonists by studying the local plants and knowledge of them. At 42, he lost his sight, likely due to glaucoma, but despite this sad darkness, he continued his research. He had a prodigious memory and relied on others to write down his words and create illustrations. In 1686, he faced another disaster. His wife and one of his daughters were killed in an earthquake. The next year, a fire ravaged the European quarter and destroyed his manuscript and all the drawings he had made before going blind. Nonetheless, the first 6 volumes of the Herbarium Ambionense was completed in 1692 and sent by ship to Holland to be printed, but the ship was sunk by the French. Runabout luck there, buddy. Stubbornly, Rumphius went back to his task, assisted by his surviving daughters, and finally, after 30 years of labor and disasters, 12 volumes with 2,000 plant descriptions and 811 illustrations were delivered to the VOC's headquarters, but the company did not publish the work because of the huge cost of printing and because it considered the information too sensitive, and so Rumphius died in 1702 without seeing his life's work published. Wow. Here's a quote by Rumphius. I beg of you to excuse me for not writing very much about the clove tree or how it is seeded and cultivated, because that is expressly forbidden. So here we have an illustration of a palm tree from his herbarium. You have actual of someone climbing the palm tree to gather the fruit, the top, all the leaves, inset of the trunk, the seeds, fruits, and flowers of the palm tree. The Pliny of the Indies. In addition to this 12-volume herbarium, Rumphius also wrote the Ambonese Curiosity Cabinet, covering shells, corals, and birds. The extent of his works earned him the nickname the Pliny of the Indies, and they are still regarded as a treasure by botanists, anthropologists, ethnologists, and chemists. Unrecognized. Although Rumphius was the first to describe many plants, Linnaeus attributed them to other botanists. Still, his name remains on several species of palms: Caryata rumphiana, or fishtail palm, Cycas rumphii, or queen sago palm, Calamus rumphii, and others, and orchids, Cologene rumphii. The specimen we have is Licuala rumphii. This specimen of the Celebes fan palm was harvested in South Sulawesi, Indonesia in 1975. Rumphius identified Licuala rumphii as a traditional Javanese treatment for tuberculosis and colitis, and modern-day medical researchers are now looking at it as a possible source for natural antibiotics. Interesting. Well, plants were the first start of healing medicines. It's good to see that they're still looking into these things, even now. So we have some dried palm leaves here. We have the information notes. It says not common in distribution, I'm assuming is what that is. And then below the rocks, 3-meter tall. Interesting. Then there's a packet of seeds. Drawing the flora of the Caribbean, Charles Plumier, monk and artist in the Antilles. So here's Charles in his, I'm assuming, monk's habit. It's got a hooded cloak. His hair cut quite short. It's just a mustache, a little bit of a beard maybe. Charles Plumier was born to a modest family in Marseille in 1646. Keen on mathematics, he entered the austere order of the Minims, and his studies took him to Rome, where he developed an interest in botany. He studied under Piton de Tournefort and went herb hunting in Provence. Then he studied painting, engraving, and lens making. Asked to participate in making an inventory of the flora of the Antilles, Plumier sailed across the Atlantic 3 times. He became the royal botanist and over 15 years wrote 22 volumes of botanical descriptions with wonderful drawings. He died near Cadiz in 1704 as he was about to set out on his 4th voyage, which would investigate the cinchona tree. So on his 2 different voyages, he went from France to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and on the other he went to Martinique and Haiti. In 1689, Santo Domingo, now Haiti. Michael Bichon, Intendant of the Royal Navy, recommended sending the famous chemist Dr. Suryan, who suggested inviting Charles Plumier, in whom he saw a wonderful talent for botany and a fine hand for drawing plants. The monks' quiet life took an unexpected turn. Although Plumier wrote little about their adventures, his traveling companion, a Dominican friar named Labat, wrote with a sharp and elegant style. Labat wrote about Suryan and Plumier. They left in 1689 and came back 18 months later, laden with seeds, leaves, roots, salts, oils, and other things, and a great many complaints about each other. Traveling partners. Plumier returned to France with only his notes and drawings because his herbarium and specimens had traveled on another ship and were lost at sea. How many times has this happened in all of these things that we've read? Still, his work was of high quality that Louis XIV appointed him the royal botanist and also financed the engraving and printing of his first book, Description des Plantes de l'Amérique, with many splendid line drawings done from life and often life size. There were ferns, Plumier's favorite, plants in a new genus he named Saurus, because they resembled a lizard's tail, arums, peppers, clematis, passion flowers, and more. He made notes of their curative properties, but his frankness betrayed him. Labat chortled, quote, "I have rarely known anyone easier to trick than this good monk." He recounted gleefully that the natives had convinced Plumier, who was terrified of snakes that might lurk on the savannas where he was collecting, that a certain vine would chase the reptiles away. The skeptical Labat shut a snake and a piece of the vine in a glass jar. The furious snake bit into the plant without any ill effects. The poor botanist, who had already drawn the vine and written up his medicinal notes, lamented loudly. Poor guy. On his next voyages in 1693 and 1696-97, he went to the other Caribbean islands, in particular the Grenadines. Although suffering greatly from malaria, he described vanilla, cacao, cotton, and begonias, named after his dear friend Bigon. In fact, it was Plumier's idea to give new botanical genera the names of explorers, doctors, or naturalists, and also named fuchsia for Leonhard Fuchs, lobelia for Mahias de Lobel, magnolia for Pierre Magnol, etc. This is an engraving of various plants from Descriptions des Plantes de l'Amérique. It's rather a jungle-looking scene with lots of different vines and trees and plants, branches. Of all the plants I have discovered on the islands of America, there are none that give me greater pleasure than the ferns. Modesty rewarded. The humble Father Plumier never gave his own name to a plant, but as an homage, Piton de Tournefort and Linnaeus named the genus Plumeria, the fragrant frangipani, for him. A nice tribute. Bestiary of the Antilles. Charles Plumier did not limit his studies to plants, and left more than 1,200 zoological drawings, some of them in color. With extraordinary precision he drew birds, snakes, lizards, turtles, fish, shells, bats, and even a crocodile that he had captured so that he could study its jaw up close. It's pretty funny. Fuchsia triphylia is the specimen This specimen of three-leaved fuchsia was harvested in Santo Domingo in 1910 by H. von Turckheim. Plumier superium was lost at sea. So here we have the leaves of a stem of this fuchsia. It has the flowers at the end in bloom, dried, taped down. Then down here we have a packet with maybe a different type of leaf, or seeds, or flower. Let's see who's next here. The first flowers from Australia. William Dampier, scholar and pirate. Although his parents were modest English farmers, William Dampier received a good education. At 16, seeking travel and knowledge, he signed on with a merchant ship. At 20, he began keeping a journal as he worked briefly as a soldier, then a plantation manager in Jamaica, and a logger in Mexico. By 1679, he had become a buccaneer and sailed around the world, gathering riches and surviving shipwrecks. He recounted his adventures in A New Voyage Round the World, which was a great success. Dampier went around the world 3 more times, and despite the rough life of a pirate, published other notable books. He retired in London, where he died in 1715. That's pretty fascinating. He was a scholarly pirate. He's got a coat and his tufted blouse, his loose curly hair. His travels started in Europe. Looks like he went down to Rio de Janeiro, across the ocean to Java, over to Bismarck Archipelago, down to Shark Bay in Australia, around the southern tip of Africa to Ascension Island, and back up to Europe. A sailor who loved his travels, a writer who loved to write about them, a pirate to fill his coffers, and a hydrographer, climatologist, and botanist. Because of his love of nature, William Dampier had the soul of an adventurer and a fine scientific mind. At the turn of the 18th century, he was able to go around the world 4 times, but only once for a legal purpose. The British Admiralty was so impressed by his first circumnavigation, which took 12 years and made him the first Englishman in Australia, that it gave him a ship, the Roebuck, and a mission. His goal was to explore New Holland, which is what Australia was called at the time, New Guinea, and the Malaysian archipelago. The voyage started badly. Dampier was an experienced pirate, but a poor captain. Suspecting his first lieutenant of mutiny, he had him thrown into prison in Brazil. It's one way to take care of a problem. The Roebuck did reach Australia eventually in August 1699, after sailing more than 6,800 miles, or 11,000 kilometers, across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. Dampier anchored in the Bay of Sharks on the arid western coast and collected many plants. He was fascinated by the strange flora of Australia, its trees and fragrant flowering shrubs, and the abundance of blue flowers. Those intense, luminous blue flowers endemic to Australia would later be classified in the genus Dampiera. Searching for fresh water, Dampier decided to go north along the coast. If he had turned southward, he might have been the first European to sail around the Australian continent. His choice did lead to making precise maps of the coast of New Guinea and exploring the then little-known Bismarck archipelago. Despite the difficulties of shipboard life, typhoons, and the problems afflicting the Roebuck, Dampier never stopped observing the lands and people, winds and currents, and plants and animals they encountered. He drew and took detailed notes, keeping his papers inside a large piece of bamboo, sealed with wax to be safe from the seawater. That was a wise precaution because the Roebuck sank in the Atlantic Ocean. The crew was able to take refuge on some rocks near Ascension Island, and Dampier saved his herbarium. After his miraculous return to England in 1710, Dampier was court-martialed for mistreatment of his lieutenant, whom he had abandoned in Brazil. Well, apparently the lieutenant made it back to Europe. Dismissed from the Royal Navy, he returned to his outlaw life and captured one of the Manila galleons and its fabulous cargo of Chinese silk. For the next century, tales of Dampier's exploits would lure many of his compatriots to adventure in the South Seas, including one Captain Cook. So in the middle here, we have a drawing of a bird, and it says, "This very much resembles," and in the Old English, their S's look like F's, the guarana, and this, the pintado bird. And then he has reference pages in his drawings for where you'll see these. Engraving of seabirds from A Voyage to New Holland in the year 1699, wherein are described the Canary Islands, Volume 3 by Captain William Dampier, 1703. Here's a quote from William. "About a league to the eastward of that point we anchored January the 5th, 1688, 2 miles from the shore and 29 fathom. Good hard sand and clean ground. New Holland is a very large tract of land. It is not yet determined whether it is an island or a main continent, but I am certain that it joins neither to Asia, Africa, nor America." I guess that was a fairly smart man. A life like a novel. The adventures of William Dampier, who survived a number of shipwrecks and described faraway lands, were the inspiration for Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Dampier in the Galapagos. More than a century and a half before Charles Darwin, Dampier spent 2 weeks in June 1684 exploring several islands in the Galapagos. He described the enormous tortoises that live on the islands and candelabra cactuses as big as a man's leg. So the specimen we have here is the Dampiera purpurea or Dampiera brownii. This specimen was harvested by Joseph Banks in 1803. So we have branches from this with small oval leaves. Alright, let's cover one more. Joseph Piton de Tournefort was born in 1656 to a well-off family in Aix-en-Provence. As soon as he saw plants, he knew he was a botanist, Fontenelle said of him. Leaving school behind, he passionately hunted plants, even in private gardens. He became a doctor and hunted plants in the Alps, Languedoc, Catalonia, and the Pyrenees. When he was a professor of botany at the Jardin Royal des Plantes, he was chosen by the Count of Pontchartrain, Louis XIV's chancellor, to go on a scholarly expedition to the Levant. His story of the journey, in the form of 22 letters to Pontchartrain, did not appear until after he died, having been run down by a carriage in a Paris street in 1708. I just can't help but find it absolutely fascinating, some of the ways of these explorers, how they end up leaving the earthly plane. It's bad luck. Or, I guess it could be revenge, maybe. So his trip starts in Paris, goes to Marseille, Constantinople, Tbilisi, to Mont-Oriat, and back to Europe. My lord, we can no longer defer giving an account of the observations we have made in our walks through the terrestrial paradise, wrote an excited Piton de Tournefort on July 27, 1701, from the foot of Mount Ararat in Turkey. But before he reached the holy land of botany, he had faced many trials. He left Marseille in April 1700 with Dr. Gondelsheimer and Aubriet the painter. They spent a year sailing between Candia, Crete, where he climbed the disappointing Mount Ida, a big, ugly, bald hump is what he called it, and the Greek islands that were then ruled by Turkey. His account of these adventures was lively and full of humor with respect to the discomfort of an explorer's travel. The botanist stayed with local people after chasing away the, quote, flies, mosquitoes, bedbugs, fleas, and ants, ate sea slug soup, try and say that 3 times fast, and rode fiery horses along mountain precipices. He narrowly escaped the scoundrels of the islands, who threw their victims into the sea with a stone tied around their necks. He faced fierce Mediterranean storms, and was harassed and held for ransom by the Turks, who accused him of spying and would not believe someone would come so far to, quote, pick up hay. In Constantinople, Tournefort carried a pistol in his pocket and was terrified of the plague, but went into rapture over the buttercups, tuberoses, hyacinths, narcissus, and lilies, and dined happily on the melons and cucumbers that grew in the palace gardens. The small expedition joined the Pasha's fleet going through the Bosporus toward Trabzon. Tournefort collected plants on the shores of the Black Sea, all the while railing against geographers who made imperfect maps. Then the 3 explorers joined a caravan for protection from robbers on their way to Erzurum. Despite the jibes of the merchants, Tournefort constantly got off his horse to, quote, crawl around on all fours, foraging in the vegetation. After a tense encounter with Kurdish raiders, the scholars arrived at the source of the Euphrates and chose one of the prettiest greenswards to spread our cloth upon, in order to refresh ourselves with some of the monastery wine. Finally, after weeks of walking, they reached the territory of the King of Persia in 1701. Their ascent of Mount Ararat was epic, threatened by tigers, Oh my goodness, they were full of themselves. Their long and perilous journey home took them through Cappadocia and Greece, and they reached Marseille at last in June 1702. Self-proclaimed martyrs. So this is actually quite a lovely botanical chart comparing Tournefort's system based on the flower and other organs on the right, with Linnaeus's on the left. This engraving once belonged to the Trousseau family. So it has here leaves, different leaf types. And over here you have, looks like different root types. Then here you have different flowers. Interesting. Here's a quote from Tournefort. We were consoled by the hope that we could visit every corner of this island despite rain, hail, thunder, and lightning that were terrifying. We collected plants with our heads down and hoods up, and did not return until evening, loaded with beautiful plants. Miscellany. Tournefort's letters were a lively mix of observations on natural resources, religion, antiquities, and botany, and comments on wine, torture, and women's appearance. Quote, we saw some pretty ones in Jurapetra, but elsewhere they are ugly. My God. A great fear of the plague. In preparation for the journey to the Levant, where plague was common, Tournefort and his companions had a stock of caustic to draw out the buboes and theriaca, the famous counter-poison of antiquity. Oh my, so this is actually a very small specimen on a very large page. It is Vesicaria reticulata. This specimen was collected by Joseph Biton de Tournefort himself. Tournefort brought back an infinite number of beautiful plants to the Jardin du Roi, including 1,356 new species and a herbarium with some 8,000 specimens. That is quite a lot. Vesicaria reticulata something 1863, and then there's more notes. Up here is a drawing, I'm assuming of the seed or nut of this plant. Well, I think that is enough for today. There's still so much more to be seen inside this fascinating book. So I hope you enjoyed this look at Explorer's Botanical Notebook, and I'll leave a link in the description of the other videos previous of this book. As always, I hope you are taking care of yourselves